Hi, my name is Brendan Goldman, and I am an associate faculty member and program manager at the Strum Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Washington. I'm also a historian of the Jews of the medieval Islamic world. I want to first thank our generous donors for making this program and many others possible. We are grateful for their support and welcome many of you who are currently in the audience. We also want to thank the Federation of Greater Seattle, Jewish Federation of Greater Seattle, for their support, and also Sarah Zades-Rosen, our own associate director, who applied for and received a grant from the Federation that has supported this talk. Finally, we'd like to thank the Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures Department at the University of Washington, who, in addition to the Strum Center, are supporting our programming. None of this would be possible without the fantastic staff at the Strum Center, including Grace Elizabeth D, Lauren Ben-Sasson, our newest staff addition, Kara Schoonmaker, Jennifer McCollum, and Daniel Yang. This talk is going to be about an hour, and subsequent to that, we will have a Q&A. And if you have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom. I will review those and ask our speaker at the end of the talk. So without further ado, Jennifer Grayson is the Rabbi Aaron D. Panken Assistant Professor of Jewish History at Hebrew Union College. She also holds a secondary affiliation as Assistant Professor of History at Xavier University. Dr. Grayson researches the social history of Arabic-speaking Jews in the medieval Middle East, primarily through the documents of the Cairo Geniza. She is currently revising her book manuscript entitled At the King's Gate, the Jews of Abbasid Baghdad, 750 to 1258, and is beginning a new project on the history of childbirth among Jews in medieval Egypt. Please join me in welcoming Professor Grayson virtually to the University of Washington. We are very excited to have her, and I will allow Professor Grayson to take us away.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction. Let me just share my screen here. So thank you. I want to begin by thanking the Strum Center and particularly Brendan Goldman for inviting me to participate in this fantastic lecture series on the Jews of Arab lands. And I also want to thank all of the co-sponsors for making this event possible. And finally, I want to thank all of you for joining me here today. My talk today picks up chronologically where Professor Zafir's talk left off last week. He took us through the period of Muhammad and the early Muslims in the 7th century. And I'll mostly be picking this up about 2 centuries later. We're also going to be shifting geographic focus a little bit from Western Arabia, where the early Muslim community arose on the peripheries of the Byzantine and Sasanian or Persian empires, to Iraq, which was really the heartland of the Sasanian Empire. Iraq, or Babel, or Babylonia in Hebrew, was also home to one of the most ancient and significant Jewish communities in the ancient Near East. Jews had resided in Iraq continuously since the Babylonian exile of 586 BCE. From the 3rd century CE onwards, it became the center of the development of rabbinic Judaism. By the year 500 CE, scholars estimate that the Jewish population of Iraq had reached a peak of as many as 2 million Jews. That would have made it the largest and most concentrated population of Jews in the world. Iraq was also home to the famous rabbinic yeshivot, or academies, of Sura and Pumbedita, which were located on the Euphrates River. These were formal hierarchical institutions devoted to the transmission and study of rabbinic tradition. Sometime between the 5th and 7th centuries, the scholars of the yeshivot collected, edited, and redacted these traditions into a text that we know today as the Babylonian Talmud. In addition to the rabbis, a figure known as the exilarch, or in Aramaic, Resh Galuta, claimed authority over the empire's Jews. The exilarchs claimed to be direct descendants of King David. As living heirs to the house of David, even in exile, they represented the personification of the biblical verse, "The scepter does not depart from Judah," that is Genesis 49:10. We know that the exilarch resided in close proximity to the Sasanian royal capital of Seleucia Ctesiphon, and according to the rabbis of the Talmud, he conducted himself largely like a Persian aristocrat. But we know very little about what powers precisely the exilarch wielded, if any. Between 632 and 750, the Arabs conquered the Middle East and the Mediterranean in the name of Islam. As a result, the vast majority of the world's Jews, upwards of 90%, came under Islamic rule. In 661, the Umayyad Caliphate established its capital in Damascus, in Syria. Iraq and its significant Jewish community was relegated to provincial status. In 750, the Abbasid dynasty successfully overthrew the Umayyads, and they transferred the imperial capital from Damascus back to Mesopotamia. In 762, they established a new capital city of Baghdad, which was about 30 kilometers from the former Sasanian capital city. As the seat of the Abbasid caliph, Baghdad served as the imperial capital of the Eastern Islamic world. For the next 200 years and even afterwards, Baghdad constituted the cultural, economic, religious, and political center of the Islamic world. It was a hub of trade, scholarship, and political power. Scholars have estimated its population as being between 500,000 and 1 million inhabitants. And this concentration of people, this huge population, is really unprecedented in the pre-modern world. So this meant that Iraq transitioned from being a provincial territory to being the heart of the Islamic Empire. And so too its Jews. During this very period, Babylonian rabbinic Judaism spread beyond the confines of Mesopotamia, the region in which it developed, and the Babylonian Talmud came to be accepted as authoritative by most Jewish communities worldwide. Jews from distant communities wrote to the heads of the Babylonian yeshivot, which were now referred to as geonim, with questions on points of Jewish law. The exilarch took up residence in Baghdad soon after the city's establishment, and the Babylonian yeshivot moved to the imperial capital city about 100 years later. In essence, rabbinic Judaism, as we understand it today, came into being at the heart of Abbasid imperial power. In my research and in my talk today, I want to explore why this was the case and what this meant for both the Jews themselves and for the Muslims who ruled over them. My argument is that the Jews of Abbasid Iraq transformed themselves and their institutions in response to both the challenges and opportunities presented by Abbasid imperial rule. This cultural, economic, and political transformation would shape the trajectory of Judaism and Jewish communal life for centuries to come. In my talk today, we will explore this transformation. I begin with an overview of the sources that have survived from the Abbasid period related to Jews and the methods I used to analyze them as historical artifacts. Then, I will examine changes in Jewish life in Abbasid Iraq during two distinct periods. The first 100 years after the Abbasid conquest, when the Babylonian yeshivot remained in Surat and Pumbedita, and the late 9th and early 10th century, after the yeshivot relocated to the imperial capital of Baghdad, and basically leading up to the period when the Abbasid Caliphate fragmented in the middle of the 940s. I will conclude by reflecting briefly on what all of this tells us about the development of medieval Judaism. Let me begin with a discussion of the sources. Until recently, if you picked up any survey of Jewish history and turned to the chapter on the Islamic conquests, you would read an account that went something like this. During the Islamic conquest of Iraq, the exilarch, Bustanai, represented the Jews of Babylonia before the caliph Umar. He signed an agreement with the Muslims, and in exchange, Umar granted him official recognition and gifted him a captive Persian princess, who was the daughter of the defeated Sasanian king. And Bustanai later married this princess. And from then on, the Muslim rulers recognized the exilarch as the head of the Jews. I'll also note that I discovered when I was preparing this presentation that there's also a graphic novel about this, since there weren't a lot of other fun visual aids for this slide. Anyway, regardless, recently, scholars have called this entire narrative into question. Last week, Hamza Zafar discussed the issues inherent in studying texts that purport to tell the history of the Islamic conquests. All of them were written down hundreds of years later in a radically different political context. That is true of this story as well. The earliest versions date to the 10th and 11th centuries. This was a period when many non-Muslim populations throughout the caliphate constructed fictitious narratives about their roles in the Arab conquests in order to ingratiate themselves to new dynasties of Muslim rulers. And this appears to be an example of a similar phenomenon. Moreover, this story seems to reflect a 10th or 11th century idealized depiction of the structure of the Jewish community and of the evidence for Umar's presence in Iraq is very limited. But more to the point, the text takes for granted the existence of a single corporate Jewish community led by an exilarch that had existed in Iraq since time immemorial. But as scholars have been demonstrating, if we look at earlier sources, either from the Talmud or from the early Islamic period, the picture that emerges of Jewish leadership is quite different. Throughout the Sasanian, Umayyad, and Abbasid periods, many different Jewish leaders claimed authority over their fellow Jews, and Jews engaged in vigorous debates about who precisely should lead them. All in all, this narrative obstructs the much more interesting story of the mutual and ongoing negotiations between Jews and Muslims that were taking place throughout the Abbasid period. And that story can only come to the fore when we analyze sources that are contemporaneous with the events in question. That is, sources that were written down much closer to the actual events that they purport to discuss. So, what sources can we use to derive a history of the Jews of Abbasid Iraq? Lucky for us, we do have, at least by the standards of medievalists, a relatively large number of sources produced in the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries. These include rabbinic responsa, documents from the Cairo Geniza, and Arabic court chronicles. And I'll discuss each of these sources now, and some of the issues that come up when we try to analyze them as historical documents. First, rabbinic responsa. These are answers to halachic or legal queries that the Geonim, the leaders of the Geonic yeshivot, were received and responded to. The benefit is that because these questions were addressed to a specific Gaon in question, we can usually date them relatively accurately. The problem is that we have few original texts of this literature. The vast majority of the Geonic responsa that we have access to were collected and then printed by rabbinic scholars in early modern Europe and even into the 19th century. So all in all, the texts that we have access to for the most part are being produced in a very, very different historical context. In many cases, when scholars copied responsa, They edited them. They removed more specific historical information, such as names, places, and details about a given situation, because they were only interested in the legal concept under discussion. In some cases, a text that might have originally been composed in, say, Judeo-Arabic, only survives in a Hebrew translation. We also don't know how representative the surviving Gaonic responsa are, and presumably we only possess a small fraction of the responsa that were actually composed during the Abbasid era. Still, these texts give us a sense of the kinds of situations that Jews were encountering during the period under discussion and of the ways in which the Gaonim responded. The second main corpus of sources for this period are the documents of the Cairo Geniza. The Hebrew word Geniza refers to the practice by which Jews traditionally dispose of sacred texts. Instead of merely throwing out old prayer books and Torahs and the like, these are given a kind of dignified send-off that distinguishes them from more mundane objects. The Cairo Geniza refers to a Geniza chamber in the attic of the Ben Ezra synagogue in Fustat or Old Cairo. During the Middle Ages, this synagogue functioned as a major communal center and as the seat of Cairo's rabbinic court. For centuries, the Jews of Cairo disposed of old manuscripts in the attic chamber of the synagogue. The majority of the manuscripts found in the chamber consist of Bible and Talmud manuscripts, as well as liturgical works. These are the kinds of texts that we would expect to see in a Geniza. But the Cairo Geniza is also somewhat unique in that it does not only preserve texts that we might categorize as sacred. Contained within it as well are over 5,000 documents that have also survived. These include court records, business contracts, administrative documents, marriage and divorce contracts, bills of sale, and letters exchanged between Jewish merchants and scholars across the Mediterranean. Most of these date to the 11th to 13th centuries, although there's a significant number from the late 10th century as well. Egypt's dry climate ensured that these papers did not disintegrate. So what can a collection of fragmentary manuscripts found in Egypt tell us about the Jews of medieval Baghdad? Most of the sources here actually do post-date the period that I'm discussing today. Nevertheless, the Geniza contains the oldest copies of rabbinic responsa, many of which are more complete than those that survived in European sources. In addition, the Geniza revealed new rabbinic text from this period that we would otherwise know nothing about. And most significantly, the Geniza preserved original copies of copies of letters and original letters written by the Babylonian Gaonim and sent to Jewish communities in Egypt and other places throughout the Mediterranean. In many cases, these texts were not preserved for posterity, and that's what makes them all the more valuable for reconstructing Jewish life during this period. The third main body of sources for this period are court chronicles and other writings composed by Muslim and Christian elites at the Abbasid court. In many cases, these are collections of anecdotes, stories that various courtiers, whether viziers, secretaries, scholars, sometimes even servants, told and retold about events in and around the Abbasid court that either they witnessed or that somebody else that they knew claimed to have witnessed. These are certainly not unbiased accounts. They represent the worldview of elite Abbasid officials. Moreover, every narrator had his, and I should say it's almost always a man, had his own bias and reason for sharing an account of a given event in a particular way. In some cases, different people will describe the same event in radically different ways. And sometimes people just, these narrators just invent conversations or entire events entirely out of thin air. In some ways, the best analogy for these texts, and I might get in trouble for saying this, is to think of these chronicles as kind of the equivalent of medieval tabloids. They were written for entertainment, it's best not to take everything they say too literally. Some of the stories that they share are just completely ludicrous, but overall, they can give us some idea of what was happening behind closed doors in these rarefied circles. When these chronicles describe Jews serving as government officials or lending money to a vizier, we can generally assume that these figures did exist, even if the precise story that was told about everyone in question may contain many fictitious elements. All of this is to say that, as with any topic in medieval history, we are working with a limited source base that we should approach with some skepticism and caution. Still, when we read rabbinic responsa, Cairo Geniza documents, and Abbasid court chronicles in dialogue with each other, they can yield a much richer picture of Jewish life in medieval Iraq. So let's delve in. You might have a stereotype that Islam was spread by the sword, that the early Muslims engaged in mass conversions, forcing people to convert or die. But this basically turns out to be inaccurate. During the 7th century, the Arabs who conquered Iraq constituted a small ruling minority. They were housed in the newly established garrison cities of Basra and Kufa, which you can see on the map, but not among the pre-existing population. Indeed, Iraq's Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians continued living in the cities, towns, and villages that they had lived in for centuries. The Arab conquerors had little interest in these groups other than to ensure that they paid taxes in exchange for protection. This would later become known as the jizya, and that they did not rebel. At this point, Islam was a revelation intended for ethnic Arabs. Non-Arabs who did convert to Islam needed to become clients of Arab tribes to join the Ummah, or Muslim community. These non-Arab Muslims were subject to certain taxes from which Arabs were exempt. This, however, began to shift over the course of the 8th century. The Abbasids expanded the benefits of Islam to non-Arabs, making Islam into a fully fledged missionary religion. Still, Iraq remained majority non-Muslim until well into the 10th century. Its rural areas probably remained majority non-Muslim for at least another century after that. Nevertheless, the establishment of the Abbasid capital of Baghdad in Iraq represented a decisive shift in the ideological orientation of the emerging Islamic empire. In contrast to the Umayyads, who ruled as ethnic Arabs, the Abbasids promoted themselves as universal rulers, the successors to the ancient Persian dynasties. They promoted their capital of Baghdad, located near the former Sasanian capital, as the center of the world. Baghdad was a round city with the caliph's palace at the center, and this served to demonstrate that the caliph himself resided at the center of the world and was equidistant from all of his subjects. The Abbasids also centralized the judiciary. Whereas previously, regional governors appointed qadis, or religious Muslim judges, now judges were authorized directly by the caliphs themselves. The Caliph al-Mansur drew on Sasanian political astrology and Zoroastrian imperial ideology to promote his rule. In doing so, he incorporated former Sasanian elites, or the descendants of these elites, including many non-Muslims, into Abbasid administration. There was a long history of Christian officials serving the Sasanians. The Church of the East, in fact, had enjoyed the official recognition of the Sasanian state. And the descendants of these families served the Abbasids in similar roles, integrating Sasanian administrative traditions with a developing classical Arabic culture. The Sasanian emperors had promoted themselves as having collected and transmitted the entirety of the ancient Persian historic, religious, and scientific heritage from antiquity to the present. The Abbasids, ethnic Arabs promoting themselves as the successors to the Persians, endeavored to translate the entirety of world knowledge into Arabic. They sought to defend the supremacy of their interpretation of Islam, not only by reference to the Quran and the Hadith, but through the use of Aristotelian reasoning. To this end, the Abbasids and other notables in Baghdad patronized a large-scale translation movement of classical Greek philosophical texts into Arabic. They relied, to a large extent, on Syriac Christian translators and administrators to carry out this project. So, overall, the 9th century Abbasid court was full of elite Christians. In fact, many Muslims came to resent the prestige of educated Christians at court. The 9th century literature and polymath Al-Jahiz complained that the, quote, common people held Christians in even higher regard than Muslims because among the Christians are many men versed in speculative theology, medicine, and astronomy. So where are the Jews? This is, after all, a talk about Jews. According to Al-Jahiz, Jews played a minimal or non-existent role in the elite culture of the caliphate. He explained, another cause for the admiration accorded by the common people to the Christians is that Christians are secretaries and servants to kings, physicians to nobles, perfumers and money changers, whereas the Jews are found to be but dyers, tanners, cuppers, butchers, and cobblers. So again, these are all very low status professions. In other words, during the early 9th century, the Jews that Muslim elites encountered in Baghdad held low status professions. They played a minimal or non-existent role in the elite cosmopolitan culture of the Abbasid court. The only exception to this was the exilarch. We know that he took up residence in Baghdad soon after the city's establishment, and this likely harkened back to the situation in the Persian period when the exilarch also resided near the Persian capital. Those Muslim writers who discussed the exilarch were aware of his claims to be a descendant of King David, and they largely accepted those. King David enjoys respect in the Islamic tradition, and these authors, regardless of ideological orientation, respected the exilarch for this prestigious lineage that linked a figure of their own day to one of such religious significance. Muslims also describe the exilarch as a counterpart of the Catholicos, the head bishop of the Church of the East, which again was the main Christian ecclesiastical hierarchy present within Iraq during this period. Nevertheless, not a single contemporaneous Muslim writer ever discusses a direct interaction with an exilarch during the early Abbasid period. And this really stands out because Muslim writers regularly talked about the activities of elite Christians at court, including the Catholicos. Overall, Muslim and Christian writers emphasized the relative powerlessness of the exilarch. He could only excommunicate someone disobedient to him, not flagellate or imprison them. Interestingly, rabbinic responsa from the same period confirmed that Jewish courts in Iraq had limited coercive powers and were unable to prevent someone from taking refuge with Muslims or with Gentiles to avoid submitting to the judgment of a Jewish court. And we also hear a story in a number of sources about a situation where two candidates for the position of exilarch sought the support of the Abbasid caliph, to basically advance their claims, but the Abbasid caliph refused to intervene. Even though when we look at the situation among Christians during this period, the caliph was regularly intervening in the high politics of the Christian church. All of this suggests then that the Jews were a relatively minor presence in Baghdad during much of the 9th century. They were less politically and culturally integrated into the cosmopolitan world of the Abbasid court than their Christian counterparts. Yet, we should not conclude from this that the Jews of Abbasid Iraq were somehow left unaffected by the broader cultural and administrative developments taking place under the early Abbasids. Yes, the yeshivot remained in Sura and Pumbedita, which, from what we can tell, likely remained majority Jewish or certainly did not have a significant Muslim presence. Yes, the Geonim and their followers continued to write texts exclusively in Hebrew and Aramaic and not in Arabic. Yet, during this very period, they began to define Judaism in a new way. We often think of Judaism as a religion of law. You might be familiar with the term halakha, which means the path. But the rabbinic texts produced before the Abbasid period do not constitute formal law codes. The Babylonian Talmud, for example, is a multi-layered compilation that contains a mix of legal, narrative, exegetical, and homiletic discussions. The Talmud itself was transmitted orally in the yeshivot of late Sasanian and early Islamic Iraq. And so, it's not really a very easy text to just look to figure out exactly what a given law on a given topic really is. During the 8th century, for the first time, the Geonim wrote down passages of the Talmud so that they could be studied outside of the yeshivot themselves. The Geonim characterized the Talmud as authoritative scripture, and they claimed the exclusive prerogative to explain and interpret its contents. During the late 8th century, Yehuda Gaon wrote the Halachot Pesukot, which is the earliest legal digest based on the Babylonian Talmud. In the 10th century, the Geonim began to write systematic legal monographs based on distinct legal topics. In essence, the Babylonian Geonim of the early Abbasid period developed the structures and procedures of Jewish law. In doing so, they transformed Judaism into a fully fledged legal system, which was based on the idea of a written scripture, that is the Torah, and oral tradition being coming from the Babylonian Talmud. But this development should not be understood as a distinctly or only internally Jewish phenomenon. Jewish law, in fact, developed in tandem with the emerging field of Islamic jurisprudence. You should note that the Hebrew word for the Jewish legal system, that is halakha, and the Arabic word sharia both mean the path. Muslim scholars in the 7th and 8th centuries had inherited many different and at times opposing legal traditions. The Abbasids, however, sought to standardize and synthesize Islamic law in order to promote their own authority as commanders of the faithful. To this end, in the 760s, the Caliph al-Mansur commissioned Malik ibn Anas al-Muwatta to write the first systematic account of Islamic law. By the 830s, as one scholar of this period explains, Muslim scholars also came to locate normative legal authority within a body of canonized sacred texts: the Quran, that is the scripture, and the Hadith, which were oral traditions about the deeds of the Prophet Muhammad. In this way, during this period of transformation and community formation, both Muslims and Jews reinterpreted the traditions that they had inherited in a structurally similar fashion. When Jews began to write legal texts in Arabic in the 10th century, they largely adopted the vocabulary of Islamic jurisprudence. In other words, we cannot understand the structure that Jewish law would come to take without taking into account the distinctly Abbasid context in which it developed. Moreover, the effects of this process of standardization were not confined to Iraq. The Abbasids had established a system of roads and a postal system that linked their capital of Baghdad to distant provinces of the empire. This facilitated long-distance communication, travel, and trade. The result was that previously distant regions and populations became more connected than ever before. The Arabic Islamic culture and system of law promoted by the Abbasids spread throughout the Islamic world. Likewise, rabbinic leaders in Iraq spread their distinctly Babylonian rabbinic ideology to Jewish communities throughout the Abbasid Caliphate and beyond. Jews throughout the Mediterranean accepted these claims and wrote to the Babylonian yeshivot with questions on all sorts of points of Jewish law. Take one example. In the middle of the 9th century, the Jews of Spain wrote to Amram Gaon in Iraq, asking about the correct order of prayers that one should recite and how this was done in Babylonia. The Gaon's response became the basis for the Sephardic or Spanish Rite liturgy for centuries to come. This exchange of letters and the exchange of responsa also served to engender bonds between elite Jewish men throughout the Caliphate and beyond. All of them studied the same texts, and as this responsum attests, they extended greetings to and prayed on each other's behalf. By the end of the Abbasid period, a Jew could travel from one end of the Caliphate to another and encountered Jews who studied the same texts and even prayed in the same way as they did. These relations between far-flung Jewish communities also took on an economic dimension. In this letter, there's also a reference to the Jews of Spain sending gold coins for the yeshivot along with their halakhic query. These payments were understood as substitutions for the donations that Jews had sent to the temple in Jerusalem during the Roman period. And these funds were used to provide stipends to the scholars of the yeshiva, further facilitating the expansion and spread of rabbinic learning. So today, when we can basically Venmo somebody halfway around the world, it's easy to overlook the significance of this kind of transfer of money. But let's think about how this kind of transaction actually would have taken place. The document on the screen is from Hebrew Union College's Geniza collection. It's a copy of a letter written by a Babylonian Gaon in the 10th century and sent to his counterparts in Spain. In the letter, the Jews of Spain are instructed to send their donations to the yeshivot to a certain Rabbi Shaul ben Yosef in Cairo, and then he in turn will send the funds on to another rabbi, Rabbi Marwan ben Avraham, who is the treasurer of the yeshivot in Baghdad. The Gaon emphasizes the trustworthiness of both individuals. You don't want to entrust your money, your donations to really just anyone. After all, these funds were traveling really, really far. To be clear, nobody was carrying this in cash. Instead, Shaul ben Yosef in Cairo would have received the funds from the Jews of Spain and written a sort of money order, like a modern check. Marwan ben Avraham would then have received this document in Baghdad, and he would have been able to cash it. But Marwan would not have just cashed any money order that he received. Instead, these two men would have had an economic partnership that ensured that each of them could stand as surety for the other. It is probably no coincidence that Marwan, the new treasurer of Baghdad, is described in the letter as a Maghrebi or Westerner. This meant that he would have had relations with a network of wealthy merchants and bakers in North Africa, and that way would have been able to transfer the money all of this way. So this letter then attests to a remarkably sophisticated financial transaction that took place over 6,000 kilometers to support the yeshivot of Babylonia. We often think of the medieval world as being very localized, but this letter, and so many others like them, demonstrate how interconnected and globalized the medieval Jewish world really was. So the Abbasids did not explicitly promote the standardization of Jewish law or the spread of Babylonian rabbinic authority throughout the Caliphate. As we have seen, they evinced little interest in the internal lives of their Jewish subjects for most of this period. Nevertheless, their imperial project is what made these developments possible. Ultimately, a caliphate proclaiming a universal message of Islam had catalyzed the rise and spread of Babylonian rabbinic Judaism worldwide. We have already seen that Jews reorganized their institutions, both culturally and economically, in response to Abbasid imperialism, even during a period when Iraq's Jews may have been more geographically and even culturally isolated from Muslims. This process, however, would only intensify. We know very little about the structure of the leadership of the Jews of Abbasid Iraq before the 10th century, or about the precise powers that they wielded, if any. We know that the exilarch directly appointed judges, but generally Jewish leaders complained about the relative powerlessness of Jewish courts during this period. But at the end of the 9th century, the Abbasid Caliphate underwent a fiscal crisis. Abbasid administrators were forced to borrow money from wealthy men in order to pay the military and keep the caliphate afloat. During this period, a few wealthy Jewish merchants came to serve as financial agents, called jahbats, at the Abbasid court. And these positions originated as part of tax collection. These individuals presided over large networks of traders throughout the Abbasid Caliphate. And within these networks, they used letters of credit to facilitate the transport of large amounts of capital and to advance loans to high-level Abbasid viziers. This development coincided with the transfer of the yeshivot from Sura and Pumbedita to Baghdad. The Gaonim cultivated close relationships with Jewish jahbats. They also reoriented their own cultural production. They began to write texts in Judeo-Arabic, that is, Arabic written in Hebrew characters. Saadia Gaon in the early 10th century, who was the leader of the yeshiva of Sura, translated the Hebrew Bible into Arabic. He and his successors composed books of philosophy and linguistics in Judeo-Arabic that were explicitly modeled after Arabic texts of the kind that had already come to prominence during the earlier Abbasid period at the Abbasid court. And many of these texts themselves also drew from the Greek philosophical tradition. The new forms of writing were uniquely situated to appeal to a newly developing Arabized Jewish courtier class throughout the Islamic Empire. Such works were unprecedented in rabbinic literature, but they would come to define medieval Jewish culture. But the rise to prominence of Jews at the Abbasid court would also transform the political organization of the Jewish community itself. Rabbinic leaders now advanced positive views of the Abbasid state, and they used their close ties to the state to advance their own authority. For example, as one of his first acts in office, Saadia Gaon composed a missive to Jewish communities residing in Fustat in Egypt on behalf of the yeshiva. In this letter from 928, he emphasizes the yeshiva's religious authority and its responsibility to promulgate Jewish law. At the same time, he also brags about the yeshiva's close relationship with high-level Jewish courtiers who served the Abbasids. He writes, "We are commanded to write to you letters of warning and admonishments to arouse your heart and to awaken your passing thoughts to the commandments of the Lord our God. And every desire and request that you have from the kingdom, meaning the state, inform us, for then we will direct them to the masters of the important houses that are in Baghdad. These are the sons of Master Natira and the sons of Master Aharon. And thus they will provide an answer to you from the king." For Saadia, the yeshiva's relationship with powerful Jewish government officials was a source of pride. And the ability to give his correspondents a forum to have their requests heard and honored by the Abbasid caliph was an integral part of his role as Gaon. During the 10th century, when rabbinic leaders had conflicts with each other, which they often did, they actually appealed to the institutions of the Abbasid state for mediation. And unlike previously, the Abbasid authorities eagerly intervened. The Jewish leaders who did emerge victorious in these struggles, in this case, actually Sadia himself, were better able to advance their power and authority over their fellow Jews. And they were able to do this in part due to the specific recognition that the government had given them. By the end of the Abbasid period, rabbinic leaders came to evince a much more positive view of the institutions of the Abbasid state. For example, at the end of the 10th century, Xavier Gaon was asked about whether Jewish courts should accept deeds of debt that were issued in Islamic courts, that is, are these legally valid documents. In his responsum, the Gaon extolled what he characterized as the just procedures of the Muslim courts in his own city of Baghdad. He writes, "It is thus our opinion that this city in which we are now, Baghdad, within the city, Gentile tribunals accept only discerning, prominent, and rich witnesses who are untainted by theft or lie or deception and who excel in their piety." However, he says, this isn't something that's totally universal. There are, in fact, distant places and villages that are not so, and their witnesses are known for their lying and deceit. So all of this shows that by the end of the Abbasid period, the Abbasids had come to take the Muslim state in general, had come to take a much more active interest in the lives and interests of their non-Muslim subject elites, and this included the Babylonian Geonim. In return, their subject elites actively promoted the legitimacy of Abbasid rule. So, to conclude, what can all of this tell us about the development of medieval Judaism? I think that there are three main takeaways. First, the Abbasid period was an era of transformation for Jews and Muslims alike. Jewish life did not change overnight, and there were many continuities from the pre-Islamic period. Nevertheless, even as early as the 8th century, Babylonian rabbinic leaders had already begun to reformulate their own institutions in response to Abbasid rule. Number two, the notion of rabbinic law that we understand today as, quote, normative halakha, or, basically what we think of today as Judaism, emerged as a distinct response to Abbasid ways of organizing knowledge. We cannot understand even so-called traditional Judaism without taking into account the historical context in which these concepts emerged. And finally, the history of the Babylonian Geonim is often told as an internal Jewish story about rabbinic authority. But all of this demonstrates that the history of the Gaonic yeshivot is intimately tied to the history of the Abbasid Caliphate and the Jewish officials who served it. In sum, we cannot understand Jewish communal history without analyzing the rabbis' many ties to Islamic state power in all of its varied incarnations. I'll conclude here, and thank you so much again for having me, and I look forward to continuing this discussion over the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Professor Grayson. That was both a fascinating, rich, and highly accessible talk. So please continue to send your questions in on the Q&A, and I will ask them. Actually, Professor Scott Nagel has his hand raised, so I'm going to allow, let's see, can I allow you? Yes, allow you to talk. So hold on, Professor Nagel, 1 second. If that is, let's see. Okay. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
All right, thank you. That was wonderful. I'm curious about this figure of the Reish Galuta. I find it interesting that the many leading figures of this sort of nascent rabbinic institution should base their authority on the lineage of David. That's a royal line. I wonder, first of all, how widespread this was amongst the competing claims of authority. And then second, if there were rival claims from, let's say, descendants of the Levitical lines, or perhaps the Tzaddokim or something. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the answer, so I think one thing to keep in mind is that at least scholars who work on the Talmudic period really emphasize that, in fact, the exilarchs and the rabbis were not necessarily entirely aligned. There's a great deal of conflict there. And often in the Talmud, the rabbis characterize the exilarch in very, very negative terms. They say, like, he's this like Persian aristocrat, he's, decadent, what have you, and they really criticize his behavior. It seems though, there's been some work done that says that, these groups start to become more aligned towards the end of the Sasanian period. And by the 10th century, during the Abbasid period, the exilarch really does seem to be somewhat of a rabbinic figure. That is, he might even be presiding over his own yeshiva. In the 10th century, we hear that the exilarch and the two Gaonim all have to agree, basically all have to sign off on different appointments. So this is something that's developing over time. The precise contours of the relationship are very, very variable. So why does the exilarch remain important? I think it really is the fact that he has this proximity to the court, to state power in the context of Iraq. And again, we don't know that it means that he really has any real powers, at least at first, but the fact that he's there and he represents this is a prestigious claim, probably to the Sasanians. It's certainly a prestigious claim to Muslims. And, for other Jewish figures who are trying to, basically figure out ways to advance and gain recognition, this figure becomes increasingly important. As to your second question, though, about competing lineages, yes, and we see a lot of different examples of this. People, for that, Arnold Franklin's book on descendants of David in the Middle Ages talks a lot about these other kinds of competing claims, people who are, emphasizing their Levitical descent, their descent from, a prophet, what have you. So these genealogical claims and these connections to the biblical past remain really, really important.
Excellent. Thank you. Professor Mika Hubia also says, thank you for this marvelous talk, which I find quite persuasive. I was wondering if you could explain how your contributions relate to Talia Fishman's work on Becoming the People of the Talmud, a very important book for thinking about the dissemination of the Babylonian Talmud.
Yeah, so that's really fascinating. And I confess I haven't, I need to go back to the precise claims of that book. So I don't necessarily, I think that regardless of when precisely we date kind of the closing of the Talmudic corpus, I think that what I'm saying here still does really work. But I think in terms, so I mean, I think I would say that regardless of, whether we say that the Talmud is completely in its final form in, before the Islamic conquest, or whether, this is still being sort of developed over the course of the 8th or 9th or even 10th century. I think that the kinds of claims that the Gaonim are making here and how this is changing really, I think it sort of very much dovetails well with the claims that she's making. And I realize I will make a note to look back at her book, because now I'm hitting a total blank on other points of connection as well.
So a number of the questions asked about, and I think this also connects back to the talk last week by Professor Zafar on issues of when we see or don't see persecution of Jewish communities, and specifically in the context of the laws of the Ahl Dhimma. And we have one question that also asked about whether there are examples of forced conversion in the Iraqi context?
Okay, great question. So the whole question of the status of dhimma during this context. So this is just a really formative and fluid period. So what some people in the audience might be thinking of is something known as the Pact of Umar. And this is sort of purportedly a conquest treaty where the conquered peoples, in this document Christians, they promise to pay a special tax, but they also promise to dress differently from Muslims, not to teach Arabic to their children, to lower their voices at prayer, what have you. So the question becomes then, where does this document come from? And scholars who've looked at really the legal tradition see that during the Abbasid period, there's a lot of debate about how precisely to deal with the presence of non-Muslims and what rules, if any, they should be subject to. During the early conquest period, it was very simple because these populations were very, very separated. So as long as the conquered peoples paid this tax, symbolizing their submission to Islam, that meant that then they were, that was really all that was required of them. Then the questions become, well, what happens when Muslims start living alongside Jews and Christians? And that leads to all sorts of tensions. And the argument then is, and this is reflected in the legal material where they basically Muslim jurists understand that you are supposed to, recognize the terms of whatever surrender treaties existed from the time of the conquest. But then they also distinguish legally between the status of, say, a pre-existing, Christian town, say, versus a Muslim town. And so that means that then maybe the Jews let's say Jews in Surah might, have a different status in this context than a Jew who's living in the city of Baghdad. However, how exactly they're defining what's a new town, what's an old town, what's a pre-existing settlement, what have you, is really, really contested. And so throughout really the 9th century, there are these different Abbasid legal jurists who are basically making different arguments for how precisely they should be treating non-Muslims. All of this sort of comes to the fore during the time period of the Caliph al-Mutawakkil in the middle of the 9th century, who basically forces out all non-Muslim, and really at this point it's all Christian state officials, and then and also seemingly requires Jews and non-Muslims to wear distinguishing clothing. That being said, this doesn't seem to really be enforced or last all that long because there are always non-Muslims serving the Abbasid state. This never really changes. So in terms of the question of persecution, they are absolutely a subordinate population, but we can't necessarily just read any given legal source and assume that that necessarily is what precisely applied to these particular populations, especially when we're talking about this context really before the 11th century. And I'm not aware of forced conversions of Jews within the context of Iraq. We hear about some Jews who are converting. Certainly conversion is something that is taking place, but that's not necessarily something that we really hear about, particularly for this community.
Great. I was wondering, can you say something about, people have an image of Jews in the medieval European context as being moneylenders whose closeness to the court is associated right specifically with that role that they play in the Western European economy. And as you mentioned, that role, to the extent to which it exists, seems to be occupied in this context by Christians. So how do we sort of explain the dissonance in the role that Jews are playing in an Islamic context and one that they're playing in a Christian Western European one?
That's a great question. So what is interesting here is, first of all, moneylenders in this context are prestigious. Again, remember, we go back to that Al-Jahiz text. Christians, they're physicians and they're moneylenders, unlike the Jews who are dyers and cuppers and whatnot. So that's the first thing, is to say that there's just a different attitude towards this profession here. The second is there's no professional under Islam. Non-Muslims can still basically hold any kind of profession. So there's nothing that is specifically forcing Jews or Christians into a specific, kind of economic box here. So that's the second point. And these populations, they predate the Muslim conquest. And that, I think, is also really important. When we look at the history of Jews in Christian Europe, they're basically invited to settle in towns precisely with the understanding that they're merchants and they're going to spark commerce. In this case, probably the vast majority of Jews are involved in some form of agricultural pursuits. That doesn't mean we certainly hear about Jews engaging in long distance trade. Certainly the examples that I gave of the transfer of money demonstrate that. And by the 10th century, we do have some Jews who are involved in these kind of sort of banking operations. So, I don't want to say that it's, that Jews are not doing this. It just takes a little bit longer, but just the whole connotation about finance and money lending in this context is just really different.
Excellent. Another question has to do with language. In what context are Jews using Hebrew? In what context are they using Arabic? And what is the actual significance of language choice in the documents that you're working with?
Yeah, that's a great question. So generally speaking, Hebrew, so in the earlier period, Hebrew is the language of the Bible. Aramaic is the language of law. It's the language that the Babylonian Talmud is written in. And when Jews adopt Arabic, in many ways, Arabic is really replacing Aramaic in this context. So Hebrew, again, remains the language of the Bible. It remains the holy language. They still will use Aramaic at times to refer to specific legal concepts. But Arabic is really what's taking over as kind of that language of prose, the language of everyday life. So they're absolutely, and then if we read, but what's interesting is, and I didn't give any examples here, but if we read a lot of letters written by or to the Gaonim, if the letter is written in Arabic or in Judeo-Arabic, it's often going to start off with an introduction that's in Hebrew, and it's like a poetic, flowy, flowery introduction. And then they sort of get down to business and they talk about that in Arabic. So, Hebrew remains this language of prestige, but increasingly people are communicating regularly in Arabic. It's the language of the empire, yeah, but so we continue having this sort of sense of diglossia, but Arabic increasingly is taking over. The other thing I'll say with that is when Jews are writing in new genres, so when they begin to want to write works of systematic theology or philosophy, which are based on these kind of Greek texts that got translated into Arabic, well, they're writing that in Arabic because they don't have the vocabulary to write that in Hebrew to talk about those concepts. And in fact, later on, when Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed is translated into Hebrew so that Jews in Europe who don't know Arabic can understand it, the translator Ibn Tubon basically has to create an entire dictionary and basically an entire new sort of technical vocabulary in Hebrew to actually discuss these concepts.
Excellent. Sorry, I'm getting more questions in, but for some reason, I don't see their specific things. Why was this question is about Judeo-Arabic. So why, if Jews are speaking and writing in Arabic, do they choose to use Hebrew characters? What's the sort of, how do we understand the use of Judeo-Arabic in this context?
So that's a great question. And I should say it's not, so it's both not unique to the Jews of the Islamic world. We have Judeo-German, which basically is Yiddish. We have Judeo-Spanish, which basically is Ladino. And so this is a very common thing among Jews and Jewish communities in different contexts. But also important is to say that it's not only something that Jews are doing. So even in medieval Iraq, there's also a language called Garshuni, which is basically Arabic written in Syriac letters. This is a language used by some of the Christians of Iraq. And I mean, we even see this phenomenon, like I was in, I think I was in Norway, and I learned that actually we have some examples of Latin texts that were written in the runic alphabet there, which I thought was fascinating. So first is to say, in the pre-modern world, there are just many different ways to write. But I think when we look at this specific context, I think one way has to do with, well, Jews who are becoming educated, they are getting educated in the Jewish tradition. They are learning to write in Hebrew, and they're very familiar with that language. And so it becomes very natural to sort of develop these texts written in that language. So that's one reason. There's also we have some examples where Jews are specifically prohibited from writing in the Arabic language, although all of that seems a little bit far-fetched. But yeah, so I mean, it very likely is also a language that, your average mildly educated Jew just has more access to this as a writing system than other kinds of writing systems. But especially for educated people, we also do see examples where sometimes somebody's letter will basically be in Judeo-Arabic, and then it kind of transitions into Arabic script for a few things. So it's all really complicated. Probably different people are doing this for different reasons. But I think it is perhaps, a way of kind of coding something as being distinctly Jewish as well.
Excellent. So I know Professor Grayson is an old friend of mine. So there's a quotation that I believe is yours in origin, which says that historians of the Cairo Geniza are in some sense the gossip columnists of the Middle Ages. So I was wondering if you could give us an example of something that we can see through the lens of the Geniza documents about this world that scholars who are looking at rabbinic responsa or Arabic chronicles would not be able to see. In other words, sort of, as you said, what does this source space allow us to get at about the sort of nature of these people's lives that wouldn't be evident from those more classical sources?
Yeah, I think one thing that I find just really fun about this stuff is just the letters that they're writing, just that sort of day in and day out correspondence. And these, and everything from these sort of very flowery introductions of trying to really sort of flatter the recipient to, kind of these complaints about money that's gone missing and whatnot, and who's responsible for that. It's really, I think in some ways the Geniza documents really sort of show us the logistics of pre-modern life in a way that just, a responsum that says, oh, and the Jews of this place addressed this question to this guy, and this is what he answered. Well, there's also a whole process by which that's being sent over thousands and thousands of miles. There's an economic component to that. There's also just a sort of communal component to that. What does it mean, if we talk about, I know that some scholars of modern Jewish history will say, well, the concept of a Jewish people is something that's more modern. But I think what's really interesting here is that in some ways, this is an imagined Jewish community. These are people who are seeing themselves as having a great deal in common and having a sense of solidarity with people that they will likely never meet in their lives. And I think that's something that we really, really comes to the fore when we read just the texture of the documents themselves, as opposed to, just these kind of what in essence are very dry rabbinic sources.
Excellent. I had a question that sort of follows up on the money lending issue, specifically if the Sharia and Halakha and Christian law are all seem to be hostile to money lending, how can money lending be a profession of prestige? In other words, how do we reconcile the prestige of the profession with the fact that the prescriptive literature seems to suggest that all of these religious traditions are hostile to taking interest on loans?
So, I mean, so one thing is just the fact that they're hostile to taking interest on loans to people who share the same religion. The other thing is that there are always ways to get around this. And, you know, even like the Jewish money lenders that I'm looking at, I mean, they discuss it as this is an advance on the payment of taxes. And then in exchange, like, you know, we'll give you some sort of a fee or something. I mean, so yes, that's obviously lending money at interest, but that's not exactly how they're describing it. But I think the other thing is just, you know, so much of, even in medieval Europe, I mean, most money lenders are Christians, they're not Jews. And, you know, sometimes it's just in specific cultural contexts when this idea of money lending can become sort of a stand-in for all sorts of anxieties that people have about what it is to live in a cash economy. What's interesting is that in the context of the Islamic world, this had been a cash economy for a really, really long time, really going back to the Sasanian period, the Byzantine period, what have you. So in some ways, this doesn't really represent the same level of change as maybe these kinds of economic transactions did in the context of particularly Christian Northern Europe.
Excellent. Had a number of questions from people who were just sort of shocked at the size of Baghdad, at the population concentration of Jews that, as you mentioned, may have been as many as 2 million in an Iraqi context. I was wondering if you could sort of give us a sense of how that was possible. In other words, how do you have a city of a million people in the medieval world, and what it actually meant to have that type of population concentration that, as you said, was unprecedented in other periods?
Absolutely. So, I mean, Iraq is known as the Fertile Crescent, not for nothing. But Iraq is extremely fertile, but it also requires a really strong state apparatus to basically dig canals and maintain canals and basically, you know, create irrigation systems and modify irrigation systems based on the changing paths of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. So when the Abbasids come in, they are this really, really strong imperial power. They invest a great deal in the maintaining, creating, reforming these irrigation systems so that they can basically feed a really, really large population. And so that's really it. And, you know, I think one of our colleagues, Phil Lieberman, has really emphasized, and I take some inspiration from his work here, thinking about Jews really remaining in some of these more rural settlements, because of course, if you're going to have a big urban population, you also need a really big rural population who's basically able to grow the food, grow the crops and then figure out ways to transfer those crops in ways that are going to feed this larger population within the city. So yeah, so it's a really extraordinary thing, but it has to do with both the geography of this region, plus as well the just really strong state apparatus that was in place during this period.
Excellent, excellent. I think if it seems we have reached the end of our questions, that was a wonderful talk. I'm not sure if I've frozen or if you've frozen there. Oh, it was frozen for a second. Yeah, really a fantastic talk, incredibly rich, and thank you for taking the time to come to us. And everyone is asking about whether they can get the recording of this. The recording will be made available. Others have requested a transcription of your lecture, so we'll see what is possible. Thank you all again for joining us. Next week, Yuval Tal will be coming to speak at 3 p.m. This coming Wednesday on Jews and Muslims in colonial Algeria, between intimacy and resentment. Professor Tal is a faculty member at Xavier University, and does really fascinating research as well. So we have that to look forward to. Thank you again, Professor Grayson. This was wonderful, and we really appreciate your sharing your expertise with us, and hope to bring you back here at some time in the future. Thanks again.
Thank you.